Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming to hear me talk about how your companies can contribute back to the open source projects that you use. This is such an important thing to be doing, and so few companies are really keeping it as a high priority, and so my hope is that you all will take some of this back with you, and we'll get even more support for the maintainers and creators of these amazing packages that we use every day. My name is Gellis. I'm a software engineer, and I work specifically on Indeed's open source team in our program office. I'm a tools engineer. I build tools. We say that at Indeed we help people get jobs, and I like to say that I help the people who help people get jobs contribute to open source. In my past lives before this, I'm one of those career changers. So I was out of college, an AmeriCorps member, doing nonprofit work. From there, I went on to be a backpacking trip leader and an outdoor educator. After that, I fell in love with the Bay Area, and I decided I needed to live there, and to do that, I needed to learn to code because there was very few other ways to make enough to live there. So I started on that path. Along the way, I taught kids to code to get my syntax down better, and then I taught adults to code through UC Berkeley's extensions coding boot camps. And now I'm at Indeed, and I'm super happy to be there, especially in an open source program office. As you can tell, I'm a bit of a do-gooder, so of course I ended up in open source. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. What is an OSPO? It stands for Open Source Program Office. What is your OSPO's purpose? So I'm actually curious, could I see a show of hands for people who are at a company that already has an open source program office? Cool, a few of you do. Wonderful. How many are at a company that doesn't have an official OSPO, but there are still some initiatives around contributing back to open source? Awesome. And probably the rest of the people in the room, but let me just check how many of you are here because your company doesn't do this and you really want them to. Great. That gives me an idea of which things to focus on. So this will be, what is your current OSPO's purpose? What should it be? Or as you help to maybe make something start, a small one or a big one, what do you want it to be? How to convince your leadership team that they should be doing this. And then once you've convinced them, how you actually can contribute back to those projects. And some resources at the end, extra ones. Okay, so an open source program office is kind of like, that's kind of the nuclear option. That would be the best way to support open source, is to have a dedicated team with engineers, with legal, with a head of the open source program office, as well as a community manager, maybe a project manager in there. That's the ideal way, but whatever your company's level is at, you can start as simple as just doing one event. You can also do something in between. I know some companies will have things like an open source guild. So you can just find some other people who agree with you and get together once in a while and talk about how you can work on these goals. These are some of the things that an OSPO can do. One is if your coworkers already have projects they've been working on, they want to open source them, an OSPO can help them figure out how to do it correctly without making a ton of mistakes. You can also support your existing open source projects. If there wasn't an OSPO, maybe people didn't do things super well, so you might have kind of some legacy code in the way that they were open sourced, and it can be really helpful to actually give some guidance. Also supporting the projects that your company depends on. Also, license compliance. Are you using the projects in accordance with their licenses? Especially for bigger companies, this is a great way to convince higher-ups that they should have an OSPO, because you do not want to get sued for something like that if you're a high-profile company. An OSPO can also help with signing CLAs, which is oh gosh, I'm forgetting that acronym all of a sudden. Contributor License Agreement. And some OSPOs will even review all contributions before they actually go to the project, just to make sure that no one has left in any identifying information or things like that. And also community development, both internal within the company, as well as external for any open source projects that you have. So I mentioned that I did an AmeriCorps year of service. At this point, it was so many years ago, but I learned a few things that I think are really relevant to small open source programs, because nonprofits are similarly often small and kind of wily in working with whatever they have. So one of the things that I learned is about a concept called resource mapping. This is basically where you go into, in the case of AmeriCorps, a neighborhood, or in this case, your company, and you look around and you don't say, well, what do we not have? What do we wish we had? But you see, what do we have? Maybe it's a whole bunch of really passionate engineers. Maybe it's some really passionate technical documentation people. Maybe it's the one legal person who's like, I know all about open source legal stuff. Maybe it's just you don't have anything except for you and one member of the senior leadership team who's like, yes, I care about this. And maybe you have some open rooms available in your company because you haven't grown to fit the space yet. Resource mapping is where you look at everything you have and you see how it all fits together so that you can get some stuff done. The other thing that I learned during my AmeriCorps year is that there are two types of nonprofits, successful and not successful. But what's less obvious is that I noticed every time the ones that were successful were the ones that were very focused, and the ones that were not successful were the ones that ran all around and tried to do everything all at once. They were clear on their mission and goals, and they weren't getting distracted by the shiny new thing that came along. So for example, if you're a small arts organization, a nonprofit, and someone's like, oh, our community needs some a community cleanup and a neighborhood watch and all of those things, those are not the things that you should be working on. It's confusing to everyone involved, and it strains your resources. On the other hand, these are two nonprofits that I worked with that did incredibly well at staying focused and at different sizes, including growing. So Casey Trees, their mission is to plant trees, street trees, throughout Washington, D.C. Ton of benefits, really important. They worked one way. They had an endowment, and that meant that every year they knew how much money they had because it was the interest from that endowment was their operating budget. So they had very few employees. All but I think one of them worked directly with volunteers. They had a ton of volunteers. We planted trees all over. They brought in an AmeriCorps team to help them. And they were able to do a little bit of social justice work as well by planting trees in under-resourced neighborhoods, but only because that was so specifically, they were still planting trees. It was just a little extra thrown in there. The Center for Economic Progress was a nonprofit that had started really tiny and had grown over the years by the time we got there. They did taxes for low-income families so that they could get the earned income tax credit. And at first they had 2 or 3 sites where they would do taxes. The next year they had added a couple more because they'd learned how to do it. The next year they were like, what should we do next? Oh, maybe we should advertise more, and they focused on that. The year after that, they added in bringing some banks in so that any people who came in who were unbanked could get bank accounts. After that, they started adding in financial literacy, and so on and so forth. And that is how an OSPO grows incrementally based on the resources that you have. So you want to be very clear on what your mission is. Perhaps your mission is that you want to be open sourcing some of the code that your coworkers have written. They're really excited. If that's your mission, then I do want to tell you a little bit about some mistakes to avoid when you're open sourcing. I got these from a talk that my grand boss, Jack Humphrey, gave. He's one of our VPs of engineering. And he made some of these mistakes at Indeed when he open sourced our first round of projects. And since then, he has created an OSPO so that we don't make them again. The first one is don't just code in secret. If it's going to be an open source project, start it out open source. That way you can get maybe some people excited. Maybe you can get a community started. It's a lot easier to just stay open once you're open. Similarly, don't do an internal fork. That is going to be the death knell of your project, whether it's at the beginning or in the middle. Don't think, oh, I'll have the internal fork that we use, but we'll keep the open source one updated. It doesn't happen. Over and over again, I've seen it doesn't happen, so don't do that. Another one is not getting any publicity. If you are going to open source a project, hopefully there's a market for it, and that one's number 4. See if people care. Is there already a consensus that everyone's using another tool that does the thing? If so, maybe don't open source it. But if not, get some publicity going, get some buzz, get a community. Maybe go on one-on-one and get some people who are excited and grow from there. It doesn't make any sense to open source something and not tell anyone. And the last one is not maintaining your project. If you open source something, you're making a commitment that you are going to pay attention to issues, you're going to get back to people within a timely manner, you will pull in any contributions that are made that make sense, things like that. So those are what to avoid if you want to be caring about your company's open source projects. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to be talking more about how your company can contribute to other projects, the ones that you use. Indeed's OSPO's mission is to build a culture of widespread, active, and recurring open source participation. And specifically, contributing back to the projects that we use. As Danielle Compton said yesterday, I don't know how many of you were at that talk, it was wonderful. It should be a partnership between the creator and the user. And not one that's based on this for that, but just working together and building something that we all can use. Oops, one sec. There we go. Once you have your mission, you'll need to figure out what your goals are. Maybe you'll want 1, 2, or 3 in the beginning. These are just 6 random ones, but what I want you to do in the very beginning is actually brainstorm all of the things that you might possibly need to do in order to reach that goal. Because then you can actually order them and figure out what makes sense. Because it's not necessarily that most important thing that you want to do first, actually. What you want to start with is anything that might be a blocker in the future. This will save you a lot of time in the long run. Maybe you are building something based off of an open source project that's not inside of your company, and so you're going to want to start talking to those people right away. Maybe it's even a project inside of your company. Maybe you'll need permissions for something. Start doing that right away. Make sure you're getting buy-in from the senior leadership team, from managers, things like that. Do that right away. Other interfacing with departments like legal, maybe marketing if you care about having a sub-brand. We have a really cool aquatic sub-brand that's fun. And we think about it in terms of caring about the ecosystem of the ocean like we care about the ecosystem of open source. And it just sort of keeps that in mind for us. Another one that you'll want to start right away is hiring if you're lucky enough to have so much buy-in that you have a budget for a team. As we all know, hiring is hard, especially for engineering right now, so start that one right away. It took Dwayne O'Brien, our head of open source, almost a year from when he started to get me on the team, and I was the first engineer. And I was an intern. So I did some really cool things, but it took a while before we were even able to get a more seasoned engineer in. And cool, so that's all of those. Once you have those potential future blockers at least started, then you can start thinking about, okay, what's most important? What is the meat of getting my vision to come to fruition? And you can start on that. Along with, what is the most exciting? What are those easy wins? So that you can go to senior leadership and say, look, I got this done. You can go to your coworkers and say, isn't this so cool that this happened? Don't you want to be a part of it? And also, it just gets you excited as well. So how do you get buy-in? It's all about figuring out why your company should care about open source sustainability. Luckily, there are a ton of great reasons. I've got like 3 slides of these. Okay, so the first one, and I feel like it's one of the most important, is that it helps you avoid vulnerabilities in the projects that you use day to day. This is super important. It's so important that earlier this year, the Linux Foundation actually created a new open source fellowship program. It's based off of Outreachy, which is another amazing program. And Linux Foundations is specifically to get some fellows in working on open source projects to squash those bugs and those vulnerabilities to make sure that we have as few security concerns as possible. If you're in the code, you know what's going on. If you're just mindlessly taking in dependencies, you don't know what's going on, and you're vulnerable. Another really important one is avoiding maintainer burnout. Some of these maintainers are doing it all alone, and if they aren't going to get any help, they'll eventually decide, some of them will decide that they don't care anymore. That can lead to abandoned projects, which makes it hard if at some point you do need something else from it, or if there are security vulnerabilities that were found, that there's no one there to even pull in a really basic change. Or even malware. I don't know how many of you heard about OpenStream, the NPM project, where the maintainer had stopped paying attention to his project anymore. It was still used as a dependency in a ton of other NPM packages. And he just sort of deprecated it, but it was there and working. And then someone came along and said, hey, I would love to take over your project and maintain it. And the maintainer was like, great, take it, please. No one wanted to do this. I didn't have the resources. I'm over it. And it turned out that person put in some malware. And some people were really annoyed with the original maintainer, but like honestly, if no one was paying enough attention to care, then I feel like it's the community's problem, not just that one maintainer. Another reason is you really can increase the speed and agility of your code by contributing back. As I mentioned, forks are terrible, both for your own projects, but also if you're consuming a project, as you probably know, if you fork it, then you have to do a ton of work anytime anything's updated to bring it back in. And it's so much easier in the long run, even though it seems harder in the short run. In the long run, it's so much easier to actually just make whatever your changes, contribute it back up, and that way everyone can benefit from it, which is really great. And then when things change, you're still caught up. You don't have an internal fork that gets further and further and further from the main branch. So it's really a win-win, which is what I love about open source in general. Another part of having everyone contributing to open source is that then you start bringing it into your company as inner source. And that's basically when you take the concepts of open source and use them within the company. What that does is it creates a culture of helping each other. If I'm on the job spotter team and I notice a problem in a DevOps tool, I can go to them and say, hey, do you want me to fix this? And if it's considered a part of my job to do that, and that's just an accepted part of the way that we work, then that helps everybody. Another part of inner source is that you get everyone thinking about using an existing project before building their own, which can save a lot of time. Now, granted, you don't always want to. Sometimes you do need to build your own thing, but take a look first. And there are a lot of people who don't because it's not a part of the company culture. You might be able to save money on licenses if you're able to get something added into the code, either because you add it or because you've been working with the community and you start talking to someone and you're like, we were thinking about adding this, and they're like, oh, I was thinking about adding that. I didn't know if anyone would care. Great, I'll make it happen. And then everything, it's better for you, it's better for everyone. Also, talent attraction, hiring is hard, but if people know you're doing good open source work, engineers are more excited to come work for you. Similarly, customers, goodwill. And the last one is moral responsibility. I feel very strongly that as companies who consume these things, it makes sense for us to give back. So hopefully, you'll come up with a few of those, and your senior leadership team will be like, wow, those are great reasons, we're in. Okay, cool. So now how can we contribute? What do we do? There are three main ways. I would say the three main categories would be money, code, and non-code contributions. So let's get specific. So as I mentioned, if you have an OSPO, you might be able to do a number of these things. If you're just one person and you want to get people started thinking about this, choose one of these to do. One of my favorites is Firsttime contributor events, and you can do them at various levels. There will be some very technical people And for them, maybe they've never contributed to open source though. So you can help them find their first issue. Let them know about tags like good first issue and help on it and things like that. And if they're not coders but designers, you can help them find what projects might need their help. During a first-time contributor event for people like that, it's great if you can actually have them choose their first thing that they're going to work on and even get started on it. And a piece of that is that when you decide to work on it, the first step is actually to respond on the issue and let everyone know, hey, I'm going to take this. Or even maybe it's something they found. Maybe it's a bug, and then the first step would be to create an issue and say, hey, this is a bug. I want to work on it and see what they say. For other people, they might not be coders, and so they might not know how to use Git and GitHub, and that would be a great thing to teach in a first-time contributor event. Study halls are similar. Basically, we end up doing a weekly one in San Francisco because that's where most of my team is based. And it's just time for people to get together and work on their contributions. Incidentally, we've noticed that a lot of our QA engineers are especially excited about open source because a lot of them want to grow from QA engineers into, I guess, software engineers, and so they see it as a good stepping stone. So we see them at the study halls. Also, you can bring employees to open source conferences. It's a great place to table, and then that way you're bringing people together, talking about open source, really building that internal community. And I would recommend bringing legal people to those conferences too. Some of the open source conferences have legal tracks. Then it's really nice to have at least one of your legal team with you, knowing what's going on. One thing that I would recommend right away is October is when Hacktoberfest starts. How many of you know about Hacktoberfest? Cool. It is basically, it's created by DigitalOcean. Anyone can sign up, and if you submit, I believe it's 5, though it might have changed this year, pull requests during the month of October, then you get a t-shirt. Doesn't seem like that big of a deal. We all have 20 million free t-shirts, but oh man, incentives do a ton. I went to a talk the other day that was showing that even when it's not a physical incentive, if it's just like a little icon next to your name, even those incentives do a huge amount. And that's a good thing to know when you're trying to incentivize contributions. Whatever little things you can do, people are into it. And so for Hacktoberfest last year, that was right after I joined. We had just gotten 3 new members of the team to supplement Dwayne, and we decided to run a Hacktoberfest event. And so we had a kickoff party, we had slides throughout the office telling people about it, and we had a closing party, and we sent like small little gifts to anyone who had contributed. Oh no, wake up. Okay. Similarly, 24 pull requests is just like Hacktoberfest, except for the month of December. For that one, we decided to send out holiday cards to anyone who had contributed during 24 pull requests. And I'm here to show you that you don't need to be perfect in your execution. This was going to be our holiday card with some decorations from the office, but we got busy. It was December. We didn't send them out right away, so they became Valentine's Day cards. And we sent them to anyone who had contributed at all since we'd been monitoring. And we were like, thank you for contributing. And people loved it. As I mentioned, contributions can be more than just code. And in fact, if you think about it, an open source project needs all of the same things that any other product needs. So things like design work for the project itself, for the project's website, even documentation. Like I just open sourced something for the first time, and I was like, I'm not good at Markdown and making my docs look good and presentable. That took me a while, to the point where I thought about bringing a designer in and then decided that I wanted to learn that skill. But for some other projects, especially with long docs, design is super necessary. In fact, documentation work in general, I know it's said often, but until I worked in an OSPO, I was very hesitant. I thought people wouldn't welcome random changes, especially if they were small. I thought, I'm a new engineer. If I don't get it, it's because I'm new. But it turns out that hasn't been the case at all. If I don't get it, it's guaranteed that other people don't get it too. And people are constantly so glad that I've contributed to the docs. I keep getting shout outs in random places. And it's a great way to be like, hi, I did minimal work and made a huge impact, and people get really excited. You can work on tiny grammar things, clarity, even tutorials for things that don't have them yet. Another piece is marketing. Marketing people can get involved in open source. Translations are necessary. One of my teammates is working on some translations right now. Even just opening an issue for something that you see is a bug is a contribution, and we value it. Or commenting on one. Even just like a little, yeah, me too, as long as you're being nice about it, is a way for the maintainers to know, oh, I should actually look at that. It's affecting a number of people. Legal, of course, and a way that you can really help maintainers to not get burnt out is a website called codetriage.com, and it helps, you can help maintainers by triaging their issues. And that is cool. Okay, so that was events and initiatives. Fostering a culture of contribution throughout the company will also just help in general, because then people are thinking about it more and more, and it becomes normalized. So we have little monitors around the office. I know other people do too. Sometimes we call it Wonka Vision, and we're constantly saying stuff about open source, like vote for the Foss Fund, Hacktoberfest is coming up, we're having a get-together, whatever we're doing. We have a lot of blog posts and wiki pages with advice on what to do if you want to contribute to an open source project, how to get the CLA signed, how to open source your own project, things like that. You can also, if you're a one-person team doing this, you can find those articles around the internet and then just post them various places. Yeah, and in terms of the first-time contributor workshops, there's a lot of info on how to run those around the internet. Even just having an open source Slack channel that people can chat in, people can ask questions in. If you are a global company like Indeed, it's nice to have some ambassadors at other offices, people who are excited like you and can, if you plan a Hacktoberfest event, they might also run one at their office. Comcast is doing something really cool. They started an open source fellows program where people could apply to be a fellow and work on only open source for, at the time they did it as a 20% program, they've decided to switch it up to 10 weeks instead so that the person can really focus. And it's great because that person or people get to work on open source projects that they're passionate about. And they're choosing a lot of projects that will help them to not have to be on licenses anymore. Because they're like, oh, well, this project, if we can just add these few things to it, we can use it, and then we won't need to use this other license thing that we're paying for. So that's another just great win-win one. And getting manager buy-in for the concept that doing this work is your work, and it should be counted in employee reviews. That's one of the big tasks that we've been tackling over the last few quarters because quarterly reviews are a big part of our culture. And so we built some contributor dashboards that employees can use to show what they've been doing. Anyone who gives us their GitHub ID, we look at their contributions and make a dashboard. It has a bunch of different insights. This is just a piece of it. And you can see how it says what repo you were in and what kind of event it was. And by doing that, you can start that conversation with your boss and be like, you can see what I did. Another way that you can contribute is, of course, money. And money should come with no strings attached. Daniel was talking about this a lot in his talk yesterday. Patronage is great and all, but not if you're saying, oh, well, you have to build what we want. Let them do their thing. We're here to help each other as a partnership. So there are a lot of new things that are popping up for this. It's very exciting. GitHub Sponsors is pretty much brand new. If you go to a repo, they'll have a contributing.md if they're, I guess, enrolled in the sponsors program, and that's one way you can give money. Open Collective is another group. You can go to their website and it will have a bunch of projects in there and show how to give them money. Some projects just even use Patreon, especially if they're small. Another thing that your company can do is hire an OS maintainer and specifically just let them work on the thing that they were working on. That is a great way to just add to the ecosystem. Other things, I only learned about Clojure together and Ruby together yesterday, and they're kind of groups of organizations that come together and decide together where to give money. And TideLift is a new initiative where it's actually a company, and they've talked to a bunch of maintainers, and they've gather everyone together, and then they go to, like let's say Indeed would come to them and say, hey, we want to support the open source projects we use. And they'd be like, great. They run their dependency analyzer, tell you what your dependencies are, and you pay them money, and they give that money on to the open source projects that are your dependencies. At Indeed, we've decided to do an initiative called the Foss Fund that we're super excited about, and I want to tell you a tiny bit about it. Essentially, it is a way of democratizing the contribution process across Indeed. Every month, we give $10,000 to an open source project, and we let Indeedians, any Indeedian can nominate any project, and we have them tell us why. And then when it comes time for voting, anyone who has contributed to open source in any way that month is allowed to vote. And we show them the reasons why people nominated them, and we've been doing it for about 6 months, and it's been very successful. We're really excited about it. We're hoping that other people might also want to start Foss funds. It doesn't have to be $10,000, even $1,000 a month, $500 a month, anything really helps out, especially the smaller projects. So these are just some places you can learn more about what the Foss Fund is if you're interested, and we'd be totally happy to help mentor you or help you figure out how to do it. We also open sourced, I made a tool that allows me to see which Indeedians whose GitHub IDs we have contributed that month, and it's called Starfish, and that allows you to super easily run your own Foss Fund if you want to. We also have a form that people can fill out if their contributions aren't on GitHub. Of course, not all contributions are. It just turns out that a really large percentage are, so the easiest way, the biggest bang for the buck, because as I said, OSPOs, like nonprofits, are small. The easiest way was just to do GitHub and let people tell us other things. All right, so you've got some buy-in, you're doing cool things. How do you keep that buy-in? You might need to measure your success. So you want to think about, actually let me go back. You want to think about what questions will really tell me how I'm doing on my goals, and what metrics do I need to gather to be able to answer those questions. If you choose the right metrics, not only will it help you answer those questions, it will also tell you what's working and what's not. Maybe you can see if I ran that first-time contributor workshop, did it get more contributors? You sometimes will even, from the data you gather, come up with new initiatives just by the information that you've gotten. We don't measure lines of code. We try not to measure contribution counts. It's a part of what we gather because it's an easy, when you're gathering them, of course it's easy to tally them up. But we don't especially reward it. We don't say, oh, you are the highest contributor, we like you best. What we care more about is people who are new contributors and people who are recurring contributors. We also don't have a scoreboard like, there's nowhere that we put up and say, hey employees, look at who's doing the best. We care most about active recurring participants, people who triggered an event that we care about 2 or more days over the course of a quarter in any of the events that we measure, which are these ones. So not just code, but also comments and issues and such. We're not doing push events because generally those are to personal projects, and it's also just not good open source hygiene. I love this XKCD, and so I thought about it when I was deciding what tools to use to do these contribution measuring. There are a ton of tools out there. They mostly look by default at an open source repo and the contributions around it and the health of that repo. Because until recently, companies were really only worried about their own open source projects. I've been seeing that shift a bit over the course of the last year, which is really exciting. So what we did, at first, I started with, Starfish actually came out of me doing a really basic crawl GitHub for user events and send it to me. And if you just want something quick and basic, you can take Starfish and switch it up really easily to do that, and I can help you if you need that. But it wasn't robust in the long run, so we're using something called GitHub Crawler. It's a Microsoft project, so it's on GitHub as Microsoft/GH-crawler, GH-crawler. And we added some code to be able to crawl user events. And that contribution will be in another week or two, so upstreamed. Once you've decided what metrics you're going to gather, you're going to need a baseline quarter, so do what we did, don't do what we did. Don't get the baseline quarter, the same quarter that you're doing all the new exciting things, because then you're going to get a really high number of contributions or whatever it is you're measuring, and then the next quarter you'll be like, oh, oops, it just went down because we're not like doing all the everything, and it's not brand new all at once. Turns out Google is a really easy way to get some basic things. The Google Forms, if you already use the Google Suite within the company, will give you people's LDAPs when they fill things out. That's how we gather GitHub IDs. When I put the basic contribution info, the numbers into a spreadsheet, it does graphs, which I hadn't known. It's normally really expensive to find out social media mentions, so we set up a Google News alert for whenever people mention Indeed open source. Not amazing, but it's quick, easy, cheap. There are also a lot of useful numbers that you might not even have realized that you wanted, but you get for free just because you're doing things. I call them the like free meal deal soda metrics. You buy the meal and you just get the soda for free. Things like you have a Slack channel, so check and see how many members you have and see how that is trending. Unique views on wiki pages, participants in the events that you're excited about, and this year we're excited to see how the numbers change. If you have physical live workshops and things, numbers of attendees. Dwayne also likes to talk about potato metrics, which is basically, there's a thing you want to measure, but it would be really hard to measure it. So how can you measure something related? Like if you want to know how many French fries you're selling, you can basically tell just by looking at how many potatoes you use. That's a potato metric. Later on, you might change from the super outdated POS system to a nice new shiny one that can actually tell you how many fries you've sold. And that's great. You can update your tooling later. But to begin with, you can use a potato metric. Okay, so how much data should you gather? At first, you can be like Pac-Man, gather up everything, go for that little like cherry that's floating around, la la la, because it's there anyway on your path. Don't go out of the way for it, but like if it's there, you're like, great, I got the cherry, that's awesome. And you might be able to see some cool things based on all of that data that you're gathering that you didn't even know you wanted. But then once you've done that and you've gotten a good baseline, I really encourage you to stop gathering all the everything, because as we all know now, metadata is actually super powerful. And right now you know who's in charge of the data. It's you, you're great. But what about 3 years down the line? What about 5 years down the line? What might leadership decide they care about later? What might they do with those metrics? You never know, so don't gather anything you don't need. And some other resources I want to tell you about, almost done. One is the ToDo Group. They're wonderful. They're a group of companies that have OSPOs or baby OSPOs that work together, collaborating on best practices, sharing tools, and training materials. There's more than 40 organizations involved now. It's in the Linux Foundation now. Highly recommended. Go to the website and look up all the various guides if you're interested. The Kaos community is there if you're really interested in metrics and community health. They're also super nice. Everyone involved in open source is really nice. That's one of the best reasons to get involved. Related to that, I made this slide super at the last minute, and I just wanted to dedicate this talk to my friend Dan, who died in the Conception diving boat accident a few weeks ago. He was co-creator and co-maintainer of Fast LED, which allows you to address all sorts of LEDs, make gorgeous art. There's amazing things online. And he just kind of epitomized the generosity of the open source community and the way that it's all about the win-win. It's all about working together to build something beautiful that everyone can use. And because of that, let me know if you'd like to talk more about any of these things. We're always happy to help. Anyone in the ToDo group is happy to help as well. And yeah, thank you so much for coming.